If you had walked into the Oval Office on a gray, freezing afternoon in the winter of 1946, you would have found President Harry Truman staring intently at a large map of the North Atlantic pinned to the wall. The Second World War was finally over. The ticker tape from the victory parades in Times Square had been swept away by the street cleaners. The boys were coming home. But Harry Truman was not a man at peace. He was a man preparing for a new kind of war, a silent war, a war that would not be fought with tanks churning up the mud of France or Marines storming the beaches of the Pacific. This war would be fought with long-range bombers in the stratosphere and nuclear submarines prowling the crushing depths of the Arctic Ocean. As Truman traced his finger across the map, his eyes kept returning to one massive white shape dominating the top of the globe, Greenland. To the average American in 1946, Greenland was nothing more than a jagged block of ice on the weather map. It was a place of Eskimos, polar bears, and eternal winter, a blank space. But to Truman and his military strategists, it was the single most important piece of real estate on the planet. They knew a terrifying secret of geography. If the Soviet Union ever decided to attack the United States, the bombers would not fly across the Atlantic or the Pacific. They would fly over the North Pole. Greenland sat directly in the middle of that highway of the apocalypse. It was the shield of North America. And there was another reason Truman was obsessed with this frozen island. It was a naval choke point known as the GIUK Gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. This narrow corridor was the only exit for Soviet submarines trying to reach the open Atlantic. If the United States controlled Greenland, they could bolt that door shut. They could turn the North Atlantic into an American lake. Truman made a decision that would remain a secret for decades. He wanted to buy Greenland, not lease it, not occupy it temporarily, own it. He authorized his Secretary of State, James Burns, to make an offer to the Danish government, $100 million in gold. In 1946, that was equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. But the story of Greenland's fate was more than a transaction. To understand why Truman thought he could simply buy an entire country, we need to look at history. In 1917, the United States had purchased Denmark's Caribbean colonies, the Danish West Indies, for $25 million in gold, transforming them into the U.S. Virgin Islands. Truman reasoned, why not do it again? But the situation in 1946 was far more complicated. The Danish ambassador in Washington, Henrik Kaufmann, a man who had defied Nazi orders during the war, had already granted the U.S. permission to build military bases on Greenland. He had essentially acted as a rogue diplomat, representing a free Denmark while the homeland was under occupation. The U.S. already had a foothold, a taste of control. Yet the Danish government in Copenhagen would not sell. Greenland was not just a frozen island, it was part of their national identity. Pride, history, and fear of the Soviet Union kept the Danes from giving it away. Truman's $100 million offer would be politely declined. Even so, the U.S. would not walk away empty-handed. Bases would be expanded, infrastructure built, and a new era of strategic occupation quietly begun. Greenland would remain in Danish hands on paper, but in reality, it would become the front line of a coming Cold War. This is where our story begins. A tale of ambition, geography, and power. A story of how the White House tried to buy a country, how empires think, and how the frozen ice of Greenland became the chessboard for global domination. If Truman's $100 million check in 1946 was politely refused, the United States didn't simply walk away. They had a new plan, one that didn't require ownership on paper. Greenland, still technically Danish, became a strategic playground for American military ambition. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had hardened. Soviet bombers and submarines were no longer theoretical threats. They were counted in secret intelligence reports, moving silently through the Arctic. The GIUK gap, that narrow channel between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, became the choke point that defined the safety of the Atlantic. The Americans moved swiftly. In 1951, the Defense of Greenland Agreement was signed. To the public, it was a treaty for cooperation and defense, but in reality, it was a lease with American teeth. Bases, radar stations, airstrips, and troop deployments, without a single dollar changing hands. Denmark kept sovereignty, but the United States controlled the strategic reality. One of the most audacious undertakings was Project Iceworm. Hidden beneath the Greenland ice sheet, engineers carved tunnels and trenches to test the possibility of placing nuclear missiles under the glacier. On the surface, the site appeared to be a research station called Cap Century. Inside, a network of underground tunnels ran for miles, housing barracks, a chapel, dining halls, and even a nuclear reactor. The plan was to turn Greenland into a mobile nuclear arsenal, impervious to Soviet detection. The project ultimately failed. Nature, not politics, was the enemy. The ice moved faster than engineers expected, and the tunnels began to collapse. Yet the idea itself was a testament to the American vision of strategic dominance. While the military dug in, the local Greenlandic Inuit population suffered. In the 1950s, the Great Eviction forced hundreds of Inuit families from their ancestral hunting grounds near Thule. They had mere days to leave, walking across the ice into the freezing north. This displacement was quietly ignored in Copenhagen, tolerated by Denmark to maintain American favor. The legacy of this injustice lingers today, a reminder that Greenland's strategic value often came at a human cost. Meanwhile, above the ice and beneath the seas, the United States prepared for every eventuality. P-3 Orion patrol planes scoured the North Atlantic, tracking Soviet submarines. Underwater sonar networks, known as SOSUS arrays, listened to every movement, every engine start across hundreds of miles of ocean floor. Greenland had become a linchpin of nuclear deterrence, a frozen island holding the line between the superpowers. By the 1970s and 80s, the Cold War escalated further. Greenland hosted early warning radar stations, scanning for Soviet missile launches. Every patrol flight, every sonar ping, every frozen runway reinforced one truth. This was American territory in all but name. The island itself became a silent front line where the stakes were measured not in lives, but in megatons. Yet the Cold War was a time of paradox. While the world feared global thermonuclear war, Greenland's local communities remained largely untouched, their people observers of a quiet battle above their heads and beneath their seas. The island was a chessboard where the pieces were bomber wings, sonar lines, and missile silos, and the players were invisible. By the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it might have seemed that Greenland's strategic relevance had ended. The ice ran undisturbed, the SOSUS array slowed to a whisper, and Thule's radar towers stood silent more often than not. But geography doesn't forget. The GIUK gap didn't shrink. The Arctic didn't stop melting. Greenland remained a geopolitical prize, quietly waiting for a new chapter. And that chapter would arrive in the 21st century, as melting ice, rare minerals, and rising global tensions brought Greenland back into the center of international attention. The lessons of Truman, the Cold War, the secret projects beneath the ice would suddenly be relevant once more. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Cold War officially ended. For a moment, Greenland seemed like it could drift back into obscurity, a frozen island of ice, quiet villages, and drifting polar bears. The B-52 patrols slowed, SOSUS arrays mothballed, and Thule's radar towers stood silent more often than not.
But geography doesn't take vacations. By the early 1900s, climate change began rewriting the Arctic map. Greenland's ice sheet started to melt at unprecedented rates, revealing new coastlines, fjords, and resources buried for millennia. Suddenly, Greenland was not just a strategic outpost, it was a treasure trove of rare earth minerals, uranium, gold, and other valuable resources that the modern world desperately needed. This caught the attention of a new generation of global powers. China, with its ambitions for a polar Silk Road, began eyeing Greenland as a potential hub for trade and logistics. In 2018, a Chinese state-owned company proposed building 3 major international airports across the island. The project was small in global terms, about $500 million.